St. Louis joins cities with a top-notch cycling track, much better than the old one. Was it really called Mr. Bumpy Face before?
It was, yeah, that was the nickname.
We slow things down and go to a place to visit a guy who can take you into the wilderness and back a couple of 100 years. And the story of the man who took on the job of getting us to the top of the arch and back down, and some of the ideas he rejected before he hit on the solution.
This is the Ferris wheel concept, and you can see people riding in the chairs.
It's all next on Living St. Louis. I'm Jim Kircher, and this is St. Louis's very own Velodrome, newly resurfaced and way faster than it used to be. Now, for a lot of people, that's not big news, but for others, well, word has spread far and wide. One Thursday evening, that's the big night of the week out here, Jeanette Barber was the first one out warming up. She's come here all the way from St. Genevieve. A fellow cyclist introduced her to track racing.
And then I kind of fell in love with it, and I've been doing it ever since.
She's not alone. Since the Velodrome reopened this summer, the turnout has been growing. The track is tucked into a corner of St. Louis's Penrose Park at Kings Highway and Interstate 70. Parking and facilities are at a minimum, but really it's all about the track. And on race days, this place is full of activity. Some here have been doing track racing for years. Others, like John Frontinardo, are new to it.
I love it. It's good training for other types of racing. Well, any type of bike racing or bike riding, that's how I feel. So yeah, that's how it was for this as well.
These are not your usual racing bikes. Track bikes have just one gear. There's no coasting, no brakes. And the track is steeply banked. It is built for speed.
People can hit speeds of 40 or mid-40s when they're in their final sprint.
So a smooth, safe surface is essential, and this track, which has been here since the early 1960s, has literally had a somewhat bumpy history. We did a story here about 10 years ago, and if you look closely, you can see there are cracks and seams in the asphalt surface. And you can figure if you can see them, those cyclists could certainly feel them.
Oh, turn 4 had duct tape on it.
This was a slow, low-level track by Velodrome standards, and while there was a dedicated group of cycling enthusiasts, this didn't have the kind of public support or awareness it did 100 years before. A kind of golden age when the newspapers would devote a whole page of the sports section to road and track races, and to the racers themselves.
People have been racing bicycles on oval tracks since there have been bicycles. And racing was a hugely popular spectator sport in the late 1800s, really before auto racing became the thing. And there were tracks and a professional cycling circuit all over the country, including St. Louis. There were big crowds, big money, and big stars. St. Louisans certainly knew of Marcus Hurley, the American who won gold medals at the 1904 Olympics.
The sport was still popular enough in the 1930s that the city built a velodrome here in Forest Park. Well, actually, this was the southeast corner of the park, but since then it's been cut off into a little slice between Oakland and Highway 40, sacrificed for the expanded interchange with Kings Highway. But if you look closely, you'll find patches of asphalt. This is the remnants of that first velodrome. You really see it from a Google Earth view, where the south end of the old track can still be made out, left from the early 60s when the city replaced it with the new banked track in Penrose Park. And when we were there in 2008, it was deteriorating. It was mostly volunteers who had managed to keep it usable.
And then the track's surface deteriorated over years, and then it got so bad that it was unraceable. And then through some city funding, some private fundraising, and some large private donations, we got the track completely resurfaced this year and restarting with, a world-class level velodrome again.
There are just over a couple of dozen velodromes in the continental United States. In the middle of the country, there are velodromes in Chicago, Indianapolis, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Ohio, and the Penrose Park Velodrome in St. Louis. Not new, but certainly improved.
We're about equal with all the other big Midwestern tracks. There's about 5 of us, and our surface now is equal to all the other tracks in the Midwest.
It draws enthusiasts from around the region, especially for sanctioned races. But it is still dependent on a core group of volunteers. Earlier that day, Casey Peters and Robert Varner were out in the afternoon getting the track ready.
Really awesome to see this project come to fruition and know people are going to be able to enjoy it properly, and it's just awesome.
Was it really called Mr. Bumpy Face before?
It was, yeah, that was the nickname.
Yeah.
They're always welcoming newcomers to the sport. Bicycles can be rented, and there is orientation, track safety, etiquette, what the different colored lines mean, and the sometimes arcane rules of different types of races.
4 non-racing laps, and then a certain number of scoring laps, where the winner of each lap scores 1 point.
As nice as this track is now, they'd like to see more here. A parking lot would be nice, some bathroom facilities, maybe some bleachers, and maybe someday, some lights.
Just a few weeks after this, some of the dirt and gravel areas had been paved over, and there is a master plan drawn up several years ago for all kinds of improvements. But for now, well, find a place to park, use the portable toilet, bring a chair or a blanket, and pack up when it gets dark. But look on the bright side, the Velodrome is back in business, and when the summer sun is going down, St. Louis is once again in a golden age of track cycling.
We've got a couple more places to visit. One is a landmark with a behind-the-scenes story. But first, Caravanager is going to take us up the Missouri River and back a couple of hundred years.
Have you ever been to a place where you can feel its story without having heard it yet? Fort Charette is one of these places. Perched high on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River, the site isn't simply a collection of historical buildings and artifacts, but it's also a time capsule of what life was like in the late 17 and early 1800s for the tenacious few that lived on the very edges of the North American wilderness. For many Americans, the 200 years that passed between Jamestown and the Lewis and Clark expedition are pretty hazy. A vague couple of centuries punctuated by Spanish explorers, French trappers, and the Revolutionary War. And the rich, millennia-long history of the Native American tribes that preceded this is even murkier in our minds. Wheelock Crosby Brown, proprietor of Fort Charette, has been working for decades to change all of that.
Okay, come on in. 30 years. 30 years to pull it together.
Historian, preservationist, and adventurer, Brown's love for history and the wilderness that remains began with his parents, who would take the family on long camping and sightseeing trips throughout North America. After military service and studying engineering, architecture, art, and world history, Brown explored Europe, where he began to realize the value of historic preservation. On what was supposed to be a visit home to Missouri, Brown took the scenic route and decided to look for the then undiscovered remains of Fort Carondelet, a Chouteau family fur trading post from 1794 to 1800. Within days, Brown had located the site, and the discovery would change the course of his life, sparking a devotion for historic preservation and education.
This is an original 1700s Missouri French voyageur dugout log canoe. The French learned to make these from the natives. And I've had this in the Missouri River 3 times, and it runs very well.
As former chief of Missouri State Historic and Archaeological Sites, Crosby Brown used his experienced eye and passion for history to start his own historic architectural firm in 1972 and begin the project that is now Fort Charette. Brown had been searching for a house where his parents could enjoy their retirement when he found an almost totally original log home built in 1797. The trouble was, the current owners were selling the house, but not the land. After fastidious photography and copious note-taking, Brown, with the help from his parents and cousin, carefully transported the home to where it now stands, and meticulous reconstruction began. But the location wasn't just chosen for its fantastic view of the Missouri River. Brown had also discovered the ruins of another French trading fort nearby.
So myself and 3 other guys did 2 months of archaeological dig of the entire perimeter of the building and the entire interior. And the archaeology was fabulous because I found the foundations and footings of the chimney and the hearth, which gave me the exact dimensions of it, plus enough original bricks that I was able to face the front of the fireplace with original brick.
As excavation continued, it began to reveal what daily life was like for the family who had lived and worked at the fort, as well as reflect the larger experience in the wilds of early North America. Many of the French who came to trap fur developed a deep respect and affection for the native people they met. Seeking to coexist instead of conquer, they traded fairly.
Their human relations with the natives was, by and large, excellent. They weren't looking for gold. They weren't looking for the fountain of youth. These were mostly individual guys who loved the wilderness, who loved the lifestyle.
The fur trade proved beneficial to both the French and the native tribes, who shared their ancient survival skills and knowledge with these Europeans.
They learned the poisonous snakes, they learned the mushrooms that are good to eat, they learned everything. So they became wilderness experts very early.
Eventually, it became common for French and Native Americans to learn each other's language, live together, hunt together, and intermarry. Brown's reconstruction of the fort and his vast collection of period artifacts gives visitors a glimpse into this lesser-known chapter of American history through the lives of a French trader, his Osage wife, and their 2 sons.
And by doing archaeology here, I was able to furnish this exactly the way it was, as far as what was going on. This is where they lived. This is her
A door was all that separated the family from their business. Perched on the edge of the wilderness, the fort offered a variety of services, in addition to the skinning, weighing, curing, and trading of furs for other goods.
Carpentry, woodworking, the blacksmithing was all over here. Why was he smithing? Well, the nearest village was St. Louis, and the only road was a mud rut hole, what we now call Manchester Road. And so he had to be able to do all of these crafts, okay, right here.
Of course, the hub of the fort was the trading counter, where necessities and luxury sat side by side.
Everything behind the counter is period, no reproductions.
Faced with a long winter and freezing temperatures, bearskin gloves and capes were perhaps the more practical option for many trappers. But a plug of tobacco or a block of tea all the way from China also provided comfort through long, lonely nights.
And if you can imagine the variety of folks who walk through this door on a daily basis, year-round, you've got some idea of how fascinating this life must have been to them.
Brown offers school and private tours of the fort and grounds by appointment, and hopes his living history site allows young people to engage with the past and consider the hard work, courage, and cooperation of those who stood in the same place over 200 years ago.
Over the years, we've got to visit a lot of interesting places, many of them off the beaten path, but sometimes the most interesting stories can be found in the most familiar places. And in St. Louis, well, there's nothing more familiar, more prominent than the Gateway Arch. But this, well, this is the inside story.
People don't just come to look at the arch. If they're up for it, they want to get to the top.
And while we have Eero Saarinen to thank for the magnificent design of the Gateway Arch, when it came to getting people to the top, he had no idea, not a clue. Yes, it's Eero Saarinen's arch, but this tram, this is Dick Bowser's tram.
Eero Saarinen worked and reworked his design for the monument on the St. Louis riverfront, and always part of his plan was for some sort of observation deck at the top. But on one of his early drawings, all he had was a door on the lower level, simply marked elevator.
No one knew how. The Saarinen firm had contacted engineers, they'd contacted all the major elevator companies. The elevator companies wanted nothing to do with it.
The job of designing a unique transport system for a unique building would fall to a guy who was at the right place at the right time. The place was Moline, Illinois, in 1960. An executive at an elevator company there had just turned down Saarinen and the Arch project when in walked a friend of his named Dick Bowser.
And when he walked in the door, his friend pointed his finger at him and said, "I didn't even think of you."
Park Service historian Bob Moore heard the story from Dick Bowser himself.
The friend dialed the Saarinen firm, and when they got someone on the phone and put Dick on the phone, the first question they asked him was, can an elevator go around a curve? That was the big stumbling block, to trying to figure this out.
Bowser was an elevator guy, but not your run-of-the-mill elevator guy. He and his father were in the mechanical parking garage business. Instead of ramps, their Bowser system garages moved cars on elevators, up and down, horizontally, diagonally. Yes, Bowser said, what Saarinen wanted was possible. And after thinking about it for a while, he agreed to give it a shot.
So he had a 2-week deadline to come up with
2 weeks.
A concept, 2
Wow.
weeks. And he went back home, worked in his basement, worked almost, 18, 20 hours a day. His wife feeding him coffee and just going on pure adrenaline. And he went through a lot of mental gymnastics to try to come up with something what might be workable. So this is, Jen, this is all the oversize? Okay.
Dick Bowser's sketches and diagrams, his notes and calculations, they're in big file folders in the archives in the old courthouse. And you can see Bowser trying out ideas and rejecting them.
There were only a few criteria that had to be met. One was the system could not distort the exterior of the gateway arch. The other was that it had to be able to move thousands of people in an 8-hour period. And as Dick Bowser sat at his drafting table, he literally spelled out the problem.
Ideas that were okay for loading were bad for viewing. Others were bad for loading but okay for viewing. His goal? A system okay to load, okay for viewing.
So these are showing when he was doing multiple elevators.
Of course, the first option was an elevator, but a traditional elevator only goes up about 300 feet before the curve gets in the way. In fact, there is a service elevator that gets about that far. People could transfer to a second angled elevator halfway up, but you'd need equipment there and an observation deck for people waiting to transfer. And adding windows, by the way, was not the deal breaker. The real problem was the second elevator would have to be smaller, carry fewer people, and that would mean a bottleneck.
You've still got to have them waiting around, and they're kind of building up in these observation rooms.
Bowser's conclusion about standard elevators? Impractical. He considered a series of escalators, but he would need too many and a price too big.
This is the Ferris wheel concept, and you can see people riding in the chairs.
He started working out a system that would provide a continuous ride up and down and under the arch. People would be on Ferris wheel-style seats. But he immediately saw a problem there, jotting down this note. The free swinging feature would be a temptation to daredevils. He started working on different enclosed seating compartments that could carry a number of people, and you begin to see the emergence of the pod concept. And instead of spacing the seats continuously, like on a Ferris wheel or a ski lift, he started grouping together the seats, here in 5 different sections. At the bottom, one group would be loading, one group would be unloading. At the top, one group would be enjoying the view through windows. But 2 groups would be stopped halfway up and halfway down.
To keep people from being claustrophobic, they would actually put windows in the leg of the arch at the 2 points where people would stop midway in the leg. So
that sort of messes with Saarinen's beautiful concept, though, doesn't
well, it did, and there were a lot of things that are surprising to us today that they were considering. There was a bubble top at one time that looked like a Canadian Pacific train. There were all different things that were being considered. The arch itself was still in flux at the time.
In his Ferris wheel system sketch, there's a single motor driving the entire operation, and Bowser figured chains or cables would have to be a half-mile long, too long to be practical. Plus, this conveyance would have to be centered inside the arch, so that when it got to the top, there wouldn't be any room for equipment or emergency stairways.
At first he was using the whole triangle of the arch.
Which
for
gets smaller
cars.
and smaller as you go up. So
Right.
that's something he has.
But that was one of the biggest things that during that 2-week period Dick was wrestling with was, everything that he tried to put into the leg of the arch, by the time it got to the top, it was too big. So his eureka moment was, I've got to design something that fits at the top and have it come down.
Bowser's solution combined the Ferris wheel and elevator. It would have rotating seats like a Ferris wheel, but they would be inside these circular pods, and those would do the rotating within a fixed ring. The rings would run on curving rails with cables and counterweights like a traditional elevator. And this wouldn't be a continuous circular ride. Separate trams would run up and down each leg, at the top stopping just short with steps leading to an observation deck. This was the idea Dick Bowser brought to Eero Saarinen.
At the end of this 2 weeks, he came up with the concept that we currently use in the arch to take people to the top.
Welcome to the top. Please exit tram cars now.
And the other thing that he did that the architecture firm and the designers loved was he decided that because of the general size he was getting with this capsule, he could make it so that he would only utilize half of the triangle inside the arch. So that allowed space for an emergency stairwell. All of the infrastructure, whether it be the electrical or whatever else, could go on the other side of the triangle. So this was all done in a 14-day period.
We're not talking about a big engineering firm.
No,
we're
talking about
one
man.
guy.
One man.
After the initial concept was approved, there had to be some changes. Bowser originally had 10 cars on every tram, and each capsule only sat 4 people. But he had to decrease the number of cars, he had to squeeze in 1 extra seat, and you can blame Eero Saarinen for that.
What happened was Saarinen changed the shape of the arch.
The arch legs originally had been further apart. Saarinen pulled them closer together, but that made for an even tighter curve at the top, and Bowser's stairs now interfered with the end of the 10-car tram.
So they could only fit 8 at the top.
To keep each tram carrying 40 people, Bowser had to now arrange seats to accommodate 5 butts and 10 knees. And now the question was efficiency. Could people squeeze in and out fast enough for these trams to move enough people per hour?
There were some things that didn't work quite right, that needed to be ironed out, and so they decided to hire Dick and bring him in just as a full-time employee so that he could be here standing by and could make sure everything was working properly.
Dick Bowser died in 2003 at the age of 82, and he is honored at the Arch if you look for him. When they put up the mural called The Builders, there, along with Saarinen, Luther E. Lee Smith, Mayors Dickman and Tucker, U.S. Representative Lenore K. Sullivan, and others, is Richard Bowser.
He's a very humble kind of guy, and he didn't want to toot his own horn too much, but you could tell how amazingly proud he was of his achievement. And one of the most memorable times I remember with Dick was when his destroyer crew had a reunion here in St. Louis, and he was able to bring them down to the arch, and we took them all up, and he could open the panels and show them all the different things that he had invented that made this work. It was a very happy day for him.
And that's tonight's Living St. Louis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Kircher, and we'll see you next time.
Living St. Louis is made possible by the support of the Mary Rankin Jordan and Eddie A. Jordan Charitable Foundation and by the members of 9 Network.